Hello, and thank you for being with us today. My name is David Yaffe. As chair of Federation's Security Committee, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to Federation's webinar on the security of our Jewish community. Before we begin our program, I'd like to address the technology we'll be relying on today. Closed captioning is available for this program. You can activate it by clicking View Subtitles at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question during the conversation, please use the Q&A feature also at the bottom of your screen. Finally, this program is being recorded and will be shared with you in the coming days. And now a little framing. One of the ironies of the situation in Colleyville, Texas 2 weeks ago is that the Torah portion for that Shabbat, Parsha B'Shalach, ended with the story of Amalek. The story goes that just after the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, the nation of Amalek launched a surprise attack to destroy them. With God's support, Moses' guidance, and Joshua's leadership, the Israelites came together to destroy Amalek. Amalek has since come to symbolize the threats to the Jewish community through the generations. Thankfully, our community has continued to come together to defeat those who would seek to destroy us. As Federation and our Security Committee followed the situation in Colleyville, we were, of course, deeply disturbed by this anti-Semitic attack. At the same time, we moved swiftly to ensure that we could continue to keep our local Jewish community safe and resilient. Our partners at the Secure Communities Network, or SCN, were well versed in the situation, and along with our partners at the Jewish Community Relations Council, coordinated in real time with local law enforcement to secure our Jewish institutions. We were relieved, but not surprised to learn later that SCN provided the training that proved life-saving for the rabbi and congregants of Congregation Beth Israel. After years of close partnership, we know firsthand how exceptional they are at what they do. What happened in Colleyville served as a stark reminder that we must remain strong and resilient in the face of those who would seek to harm us. I want to assure everyone here today that our community's safety and security remains a top priority for the Jewish Federation. Across DC, Maryland, and Northern Virginia, our regional security advisor, Robert Graves, works closely with Jewish institutions, organizations, and individuals throughout Greater Washington to help assess, develop, and prepare security plans, and trains the community for a multitude of emergency situations. Robert also maintains close relationships with local law enforcement and helps organizations seeking security enhancement grant funding. Later on in our program, we'll have the opportunity to hear directly from Robert, as well as from Rabbi Amy Schwartzman, Senior Rabbi of Temple Rodef Shalom in Falls Church, Virginia. They'll join our Federation CEO, Gil Preuss, in conversation on this important topic. But first, I'm honored to introduce Michael Masters, National Director and CEO of Secure Community Network, for his overview of the national and local security landscape today.
David, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to join all of you here today in partnership. It really is an honor, and we're very, very grateful. I'd like to talk about the events in Colleyville, but before I talk about the events of 2 weeks ago, I really want to go back to what David mentioned, which was the events that happened much prior to that, August 22nd of 2021. That was the day that SCN led a training exercise at Congregation Beth Israel in Colllaville. It was attended by Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker and 21 other congregants. Working in coordination with the Jewish Federation of Fort Worth and Tarrant County, we worked with the congregants, as David mentioned, on how to recognize suspicious behavior and activity, as well as what to do during an active threat situation. Most importantly, one of the key principles that was taught that day was to commit to action. Commit to action is exactly what the Beth Israel hostages did. As Jeff Cohen said, they weren't rescued, they escaped. And it's what we all have to do. Today, the Jewish community is under threat. We've seen an increase in hate crimes, active vandalism, harassment, and targeted violence. But the key message is we are not powerless. Last year, SCN trained over 17,000 members of the Jewish community. The training in Collaville, from its development to delivery, occurred because we came together, the Federation, SCN, and the community, to prepare. We collectively committed to action. And just as David mentioned, the components of the program that you have in Washington, assessments, intelligence sharing, coordination with law enforcement, all of that was part of the work that we did collaboratively in Colleyville prior to the attack 2 weeks ago. There's a lesson to be learned there. We will not choose the time and place of the next incident, but we can choose our preparation, and we have to. Every synagogue, every facility has to be assessed. It has to have a security plan. It has to have training. Law enforcement needs the security, the detailed floor plans of each building. This must be a part of a comprehensive plan that involves all of those things. And this is exactly the work that's underway through the partnership between the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington and SCN. Our mission at SCN is to ensure the safety, security, and resiliency of the Jewish community in North America. But we all know that that's a shared mission between all of us. We have to work to build the security shield over the North American Jewish community together, and that's exactly what we're doing. I want to recognize and thank Gil for his incredible leadership and partnership, as well as Naomi, David for his leadership of the Security Committee, and I want to recognize and thank Robert Graves for his tireless work. In 2017, just 22 federations had professional full-time security initiatives. And we can talk about the threats and statistics of anti-Semitism, but I would like to talk more about what we're doing to address it. So 22 security initiatives, that meant just 7% of our community had access to a vital resource that had the potential to save lives. Working together, and in just 4 years, we have dramatically changed that landscape. Today, there are 50 full-time professionally led community security initiatives across the United States, just like the one you have. They are tied together through SCN's Jewish Security Operations Command Center. That was the entity, as David noted, that was doing that direct coordination with law enforcement, with our security directors like Robert, within minutes of identifying the attack. From threats on social media to the dark web, to reports from community members just like you, 11,000 incidents, reports, and threats addressed last year, with hundreds of referrals to federal, state, and local law enforcement. And it makes a difference. That's why we knew about the attack so quickly 2 weeks ago. It's how we identified the offender, how we worked with the Dallas Federation, FBI, and DHS, convening a call with all the security directors nationally, and keeping people updated throughout the community. This work goes on every day. Last week, when flyers appeared from the Goyim Defense League in Florida, California, Texas, and elsewhere, it was the network of professional security directors, Robert and his colleagues, who identified those and reported them into SCN's duty desk that allowed us to alert federal law enforcement to the national nature of the issue and work with them. And beyond the intelligence sharing, it's about all those other things, training, assessments, that we need to be getting done and having all of you involved with. And it's so critical because our community is not static. The best practice comprehensive approach to doing this is a unique attribute of our federation system. Someone grows up in Cleveland, they go to school in Boston, they get a job here in Washington, D.C., they choose to raise a family, their kids go to school here and they go to camp in Pennsylvania. We can't afford to have different processes and procedures across all of our community. The threats we are facing, not just as members of the Jewish community in this society, but as members of society, from increased crime in our cities to targeted violence, are real. They're dangerous and they can be deadly. So we need to take our preparedness seriously. We can't succumb to a sense of fear. We have to embrace a mindset of empowerment. We believe that we can make that difference. Just yesterday, over 9,200 people registered for our Be Aware webinar. Today, over 100% of communities have access to SCN's duty desk, and over 85% of our community has access to a professional security resource, just like Robert. That's because of the partnerships like the one here with JFGW. Thankfully, SCN conducted the training at Beth Israel. Thankfully, members of your community are being trained in those same processes and procedures and protocols. We need to carry that forward as a whole community. You are doing that work in Washington, Maryland, and Virginia. I want to say a word about Robert. He spent his career in federal law enforcement, pursuing criminals and terrorists and undertaking complex investigations. He understands the necessity of the work. We are fortunate to have him and men and women like him who are committed to it, who are ensuring every day that our whole community is prepared and protected. But he's not alone. You are not alone. You have an entire team at SCN, from analysts to training developers to physical security specialists, who are working to support Robert and support the community in partnership. And there is no replacement for his experience, knowledge, and professional training at the community level. That approach that you are taking is vital. Just look at the impact. 51 community organizations applied for NSGP grants last year in your federation's catchment area, a 60% increase. 27 community organizations were awarded over $3.4 million in grants, an increase of 40% and a near doubling of the total award amount. 70 trainings for 2,000 community members. And I'd like to highlight, of the 17,000 people that we trained, your federation has the single highest representation from any federation singularly across the United States. And that's an achievement to be proud of. And your federation is convening the region's first ever communal security committee. This is impact. This is leadership. And this is making the community safer and more secure. Robert is rolling out the training exactly like the training that was received in Colleyville, exactly like the Be Aware training that was given yesterday to your community now. And we're going to continue to roll out initiatives in partnership like that to keep our community safer. For 3,000 years as a people, we have faced threats, but when we come together, there is nothing that can stop us. And I believe that. We have a choice to make. And I said this yesterday: to allow fear to win and hatred to prevail, or to stand up and to prepare and to protect our community, to empower one another. This is one of the greatest attributes of our collective federation system. It has done this for well over 100 years, but the threat isn't in another city or on another continent. It is here in this country. So we have to turn, as you are doing in Washington, that collective power of our federation system to ensure our own safety and security. We are proud to partner with you in that endeavor. We are going to continue to partner with you, and we are so thankful for your leadership, for your commitment, and for your involvement. We will continue to do this together to keep our tradition, our history, our culture alive today, tomorrow, and for future generations, so no one ever questions whether it's safe to be Jewish in the United States, whether it's safe to walk into a federation, a day school, or send their kids to summer camp. Thank you so much for that partnership. We will continue onwards together.
Thank you so much, Michael, and for your leadership and everything that you have been doing. For those who don't know me, my name is Gil Preuss, and I'm the CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington. In addition to Michael, who will stay with us and be back in a second for our Q&A portion of this program, I'm also pleased to introduce Rabbi Amy Schwartzman, Senior Rabbi of Temple Rodef Shalom in Falls Church, Virginia, and Robert Graves, Federation and SCN's Regional Security Advisor for the National Capital Area, who you've heard about from Michael. I'll be facilitating our Q&A with all three of our guests, with questions that include those submitted in advance by some of our webinar attendees, as well as others. If you have additional questions as we talk, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, and we'll address as many as we can. So, Amy, let me start with you. Temple Rodef Shalom is the largest synagogue in Virginia. How do you think about security? Are you thinking about it differently now than perhaps you did 2 weeks ago or 3 years ago even?
Thank you, Gil, and thanks to everyone for not only hosting this event, but including the congregational perspective as well as this excellent security team. I think your question, Gil, is of course spot on. I'm very lucky to be part of a community that has had a robust commitment to security for a long time. However, of course, the recent events have caused us to relook at all of our practices. And when we look at security, I would say that we look at it through a number of different lenses. First of all, we look at it through our building, through our hardscape, thinking about all the things that one must consider, such as doors and cameras and layout and a physical security plan. All of that material, all those material things, we have to evaluate that on a regular basis. But when we think about security, we also think about the people who are in the building all the time. And as we've heard from Michael and I know from Robert too, we're going to hear the importance of training, how well we're trained, how well we're prepared, how knowledgeable the members of our staff are and our congregants. So we talked about Colleyville and how the congregants themselves were given the opportunity to train. So we think of building, we think of people. We also think of our public presence. So I don't think we can ignore social media and the way the outside world sees us and is privy to information about what we're doing, who we are, and what's happening in our building. So I don't know, yes, we have stepped up and reviewed, but we're very lucky to have had a very good foundation here at Rodef Shalom.
Thank you. Robert, you've worked with many synagogues in the region. And would love to understand, when you go and meet with synagogue leadership, how do you approach it? Especially because we know synagogues are different. So Rodef Shalom is a large organization with resources. Others may not have resources. How do you approach the conversation with them as they start to think about security for their own organization?
Thank you, Gil. The first step is always to listen. We want to understand the nature of that community, its constituencies, its functions of the organization, its resources available, its needs and concerns, and its expectations as far as security. And working together, we seek to find that balance between measures that keep us safe and at the same time allow the organization to do what it's there for. The function of security is to enable the mission, enable the purpose of the organization in as safe a manner as possible. So it's critical that we have that listen first, understand, and then find the balance between technologies and techniques for each organization to build a strategy of multiple parts, of multiple layers that meets the needs of that organization, that synagogue, that school, that community center.
Thanks. And let me just bring that back to you, Amy, as well. The trade-offs that may exist in terms of openness or being closed, welcoming versus separate, and I'm posing them as, you know, kind of an opposite to each other, but maybe they're not. Would love to think about did Rodef Shalom kind of struggle with these debates? Have they come up again? Particularly noting, I mean, so much in the media that the Rabbi Beth Israel invited in the person who eventually held them hostage for tea. He knocked on the door, wanted to come in. How does Rodef Shalom, or how do you think about some of these potential tensions and trade-offs?
They are indeed real tensions. They're not always completely binary, though. And indeed, I'm sure every member of a congregation here knows that there are members of the congregation who are aligned themselves with like creating sort of a fortress around their building with fences and things like that. And there are others who are more drawn to sort of the way Rabbi Citron Walker, openness. There are members of my congregation who feel strongly about whether we will or will not have weapons on our security people. All these are issues. How the question of how we hold on to our values and our mission and our purpose, to Robert's comment, thank you for that, Robert, and keep everybody there safe is definitely really difficult. And it requires also a lot of listening. It also requires, I think, study. I think we're gifted with a tremendous tradition that gives us a platform for conversation that allows different issues to rise up and be clarified. I also think it's really important that congregations, to the appropriate degree, be transparent with their members and make it clear why they've made the decisions they've made about any of these given things. I definitely am the person who who most often beats the drum of kind of our values and our mission. And I have other people, even on my clergy team, who help balance that. And I'd like to think that our members too have a place to bring their concerns, and that we validate their ideas by doing a lot of listening and engaging them in conversation and study.
Thank you. So when we think about these issues, I mean, obviously on one hand is the conversations that exist within the community, within a congregation, within an organization, but these things get played out in specific practice. And I just want to kind of, the message, the welcoming, the reactions of people. And I want to ask, and this is really for all three of you, and we got this question from one of the attendees in advance, and it goes along the lines of, my synagogue can't afford more than locked doors and a buzzer. And so on Shabbat, members let people in. Now, that experience of when someone first walks up to the synagogue, and what happens? The member who's there all the time, or the person who's maybe there for a bar mitzvah or a visitor, and how they're treated, right? So when we think about security, a lot of it may occur in that moment, or maybe I'm wrong. Would love to hear, perhaps from all three of you, kind of different things that you've seen, and what does that communicate about security? What are the trade-offs, in terms of security, community? Are there ways of actually being both very secure and also welcoming and open?
I'll maybe take a first stab at that. I think that there is always a way to be safe and secure while being welcome and opening. And I think that goes to the ethos of the institution. And it's why, and I agree with the rabbi, it's so critical that these conversations take place. There is no one answer. And it depends on the answer that you can give to that in one community is different than another community, and it's going to be different from institution to institution, which is why I think we need to foster that incredible tradition that we have of dialogue and debate and discussion to get to the right answer that works for the institution. In terms of tachlis, and there is no right answer. I mean, if you think about, to the rabbi's point, Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker made a decision. He made the decision to let the individual into the synagogue. And any number of people can debate and analyze that one way or the other. At the end of the day, what we know from the offender's own statements was that he was prepared to shoot his way into the building. And instead, what he said, and what in his own words, he said, the door was opened for me, I was offered tea, and the rabbi was very nice to me. I don't think that any of us can underestimate the impact that engagement had and the relationship that was formed over the next 11 hours. You can't segregate things in the outcomes. And I think it's very important. That's why that we have to approach this holistically. It's not just a locked door. It is the reception, the training that goes into the people that are at the front door. And that's why I think it's so important that you have a program as you do, because in a society that we live in, and there was a question in the chat, we have an increasing diversity within our own community. Our institutions themselves are institutions which provide often a variety of different services. It's important that the training that is done not be based on appearance, but based on behavioral indicators and things that we can affirmatively point to that are validated with science, so that you can tell the difference between someone that is maybe someone that has a mental health issue or they're in crisis, or versus someone that really is intent on danger. And those distinctions really go to the professionalism of the training, and the necessity of that being on an ongoing, continuous basis for all members of the community. I think when you do that, you can create that environment that is welcome and opening, but also is safe and secure, not because we also want it to be welcome and opening once you're inside. And if people are sitting there feeling insecure when they're in the building because there wasn't adequate security on the outside of the building, that doesn't help us either. So I think there is a way to strike that balance. It needs to be done very thoughtfully, and it's specific to each community and each institution, but it benefits from the best standards and the comprehensive approach that I think you're implementing in DC.
Thank you. Have anything to add, or?
I would just take it one step additional, Gil. One of the things we encourage when we talk to the synagogues here in our community is that whomever is, whether they're outside on the front steps or they're inside the lobby, we should always engage everyone who comes to our houses of worship the same way, whether there's someone we see each week, someone we only see on high holy days, or someone we've never seen before, with a warm hello, welcome, what brings you here today, how can I help you? Whether it's your friend that you see all the time or someone you've never seen before, you're going to have that moment of human engagement. And if you have a reason for concern, that's where you'll learn it, or perhaps you'll just make a new friend. But if we greet everybody with that welcoming attitude, all people that come in, then I think we're off to the right step as far as the welcoming and giving ourselves a chance to learn more about the individual. First as an individual, and then we can take it further and see if a safety problem comes to the fore.
I would just chime in from the lay perspective, at least in terms of security. First of all, just to put myself out there, I would have been right there making the tea next to my colleague, Charlie. And I think that we are a congregation that has a hospitality committee. And it's really important that those people who sign up for that are trained in the types of things that you both talked about just now. I also think a valuable technique or something that's important is when I meet someone for the very first time who's coming into the building, whether it's at Shabbat services or some other time, if I don't know them, it's wise for me to introduce them quite early on to another person so that there are two of us who are part of not only the welcoming and that whole experience, but also kind of assessing and, taking the temperature of the situation. I might not be clued into something that someone else might be more clued into. And so whether it's one of my colleagues or a leader in my congregation who I know is trained, I'd love to introduce someone so that we're a little bit more aware that we're welcoming someone new and we have a few more eyes and ears on the situation. That is, of course, assuming the other person also has some awareness and training. So, there are, for those of people who don't have all the resources to have a paid security person, clearly having trained members, even people who are just more aware and sharing that burden is important.
Thank you. In a second, we're going to get to a couple of questions having to do with some other security issues, but I'd like to focus a little bit more on the training. And Michael, you talked about it a lot, obviously, in the first part of the conversation, and that's been one of the biggest things on the news coming out of the successful ending of the Colleyville hostage taking and attack. The focus on training and the importance of training. I'd love just a little bit more. I mean, maybe Robert, you can take this about some of the types of trainings for people who are interested going forward that are available, or things that they can reach out to you potentially, for their institution to participate in.
Certainly, Gil. As Michael mentioned earlier in his remarks, the Be Aware situational awareness training, which we debuted in a webinar yesterday, is available. I think it's a great first step for everybody. You don't have to have a security role in your organization, in your synagogue. It is just good training about being aware of your surroundings wherever you are, to recognize a potential problem and feel empowered to take an action, for that commitment to action that Michael talked about as well. The Be Aware training is the first step. We do have our countering active threat training, which is a little more focused on what do we do when we have an armed intruder in our space, whatever space we're in, whether it's at synagogue or a commercial space, but what do we do in response to an armed intruder? What are the techniques we can apply for a safer outcome of those kinds of situations? We also do some very focused training for the ushers or those hospitality committees. We combine the other two trainings. It's just a very focused training for those members of our volunteers and our staffs that are, shall we say, are front facing or public facing. So we have those available as well. We also can do Stop the Bleed training, which is an advanced first aid course to help with critical injuries in those critical moments as well. All those trainings are available through me. You can contact us through Federation's website, and we'll get you or your organization scheduled for those trainings. And they're top shelf. They meet the standards of our federal law enforcement partners and other partners in the Homeland Security and emergency preparedness arenas. And I'm very proud to be able to deliver those to this community.
Thank you. I want to touch on two questions that are slightly different, but they both deal with carrying, having armed personnel. So the first one was more specific, and there was someone who said that their son-in-law is required to carry a gun at all times for work. Should they let the synagogue staff know about this when they come in about that? And I guess probably both from the security perspective as well as the rabbinic perspective might be interested. I don't know if it's the same or different answer. And then the second one, which is a larger question, and I know there have been discussions in the past, and it's an ongoing question. In fact, it was in the synagogue, Beth Israel in Texas as well. Should there be armed personnel at synagogues? You know, paid armed personnel, whether synagogue members who specifically are known to be armed, or armed security personnel. And so why don't we start with that second one first, about kind of best approach and thoughts around that, and either Robert or Michael, and then we can talk about the larger one about if you are required, should you inform to carry weapons, should you inform others? Who would like to take the?
Robert, why don't you go first for the localized answer, which is, I think, is the critical one.
The localized in terms of what we should do for an individual who's required to carry a firearm at all times. I would take that question to mean that her son-in-law is in fact a sworn law enforcement officer, and that's why he's carrying a weapon at all time. I would encourage him to make his status known to the leadership of his synagogue and to any safety team that's on site, so they're aware he's there and that he is armed, kind of going forward. Definitely for their situation awareness, I think that's important. Do you want to handle the larger question, sir?
Sure. Thank you, Robert. And you'll note I'm going to defer to Robert on a lot of things, because the reality is he's on the ground and he's working in the community. And that's why these answers differ so much depending on where you are. And it's really vital that we get that perspective. On the larger question, there is no one answer. What we did 2 years ago was SCN convened a group of national experts on the firearms question. Individuals that were active in law enforcement, police chiefs, federal, state, local, as well as a cadre of the security directors from around the country. And we came out with a paper called Firearms and the Faithful. That paper is designed to provide optionality to synagogues. At the end of the day, and I'm curious for the rabbi's opinion on this. What the synagogue chooses to do is going to dictate the approach they take. We can't. It is so localized to the community. As we heard, there are some synagogues that are open to having armed personnel. There are others that are not. There are individuals in the community that are made to feel less safe when armed presence is around, and all of those things need to be taken into consideration. So Firearms and the Faithful seeks to work through the questions that institutions should ask themselves if they wish to pursue an idea of having someone with a firearm. And the questions are, we've had many synagogues that say, well, I know congregants are carrying, I just don't acknowledge it. Well, as a lawyer, admittedly not a practicing one anymore, but as a lawyer, I can tell you that is not a good answer should something happen, and for you to have known about it as a synagogue, but chosen not to acknowledge it. The liability issues, the insurance questions, these are all things that need to be thought through. Ultimately, what the group recommended was that if someone is going to have armed security, the best recommendation, if it was feasible, was to have armed on or off duty law enforcement that was uniformed in that function, because it provided not just a visible deterrent, but they had the capacity to deal with a situation, and not just a lethal situation. One of the most important things that law enforcement officers, many well-trained officers get, is training in how to de-escalate a situation, implicit bias training, suspicious indicator training that's not based on how someone looks, but their behavior. Those are very, very vital in today's day and age. And it contributed to why the ultimate recommendation from the paper was to go with individuals that receive that training more comprehensively than, say, just a person that has a license to carry a firearm. But at the end of the day, if that option is not available, we sought to provide the questions that need to be asked and answered in order to do any solution effectively.
Thank you.
It has been our custom until recently, when there has been a shortage of police in our area, as there is nationally, I believe, to have an armed, uniformed police person on our property during our high touch times, which include worship and also our religious school. It's been our understanding from these individuals who are carrying weapons that in the event of an event inside our sanctuary, if this officer were to come into the sanctuary to deal with a situation where someone has a gun and 3 people have guns out, that officer does not know who is the congregant and who is not the congregant. And so that officer will do everything that he or she can to end anyone with a gun, which is an enormous risk and very scary. And not to mention, our police have also helped us to understand that dealing with a incident in close quarters, I think it might have a term to it, close quarter or something, or takes a highly trained person. That just because you own a gun and you carry a gun doesn't mean you are really trained to handle a situation where there's a sanctuary full of people. And so, we have fallen on the line of what you've recommended there, Michael, in terms of trying our best to have our local police with us at these important and, potentially risky times, vulnerable times. We have asked our members not to bring their weapons into our sanctuary. Some may be doing that without our knowledge. Also, you might want to ask, and I'm sure this is part of the questions that were in this paper, which I'm eager to read. What does it do to the experience of other worshipers? How does it change what feels like the sanctity of this space? Our congregation, our building is for us a sacred home. And what does it feel like to have weapons in that sacred home? What is it like for our children to walk into a building and see guns on people inside their sanctuary, inside the place that they practice their Judaism? We can meet the needs of security. We hope to, at least with that armed and uniformed guard on the outside, our police person. But we'd like to try, at least we're in the place at this moment, to preserve the sanctity within the building to the best of our ability. I'm not sure that answers the entire question. It is an ongoing conversation that's happening right here and right now as well. So continues to come up.
So let me push on this a little bit, and we just got a question, and there was one earlier as well. We obviously live within a broader society where the experiences that different people have with police are very different, particularly people of color, Jews of color, others, where the dynamic and the sense of security or response is different. And I know, Michael, you spoke a lot about the training, the implicit bias training, and looking at behaviors as opposed to other things. So I guess I'd like to kind of ask the question both in terms of police and how to address the different responses that people may have to police and the implications if we're trying to create a community where all parts of the Jewish community feel that they belong. And we've seen research around the Jewish community, anywhere between 10 to 15% of Jews are Jews of color. It's higher among younger members of the Jewish community. What does that look like? And it's both with police who have the training, but people may see them in a certain way, but also with volunteers who may not be as experienced and may, respond to biases even more so if they have certain assumptions about who's a Jew and who's not a Jew and who's welcome and who's not. So first, I'd like to start with a question about the police and how do we as a community address some of the challenges that may pose for subsegments of the Jewish community?
I think it's a great question. And the fact that we are having it as a community is really the first step. And it is very, very important that there is a recognition of the diversity within the community. It took a long time for, I think, the community to recognize there was diversity within how we approach security between different movements. And even the sense within the Orthodox community of being more visible and more targeted by acts of anti-Semitism. And now also incorporating in the notions of diversity that, as you just indicated, Gil, we as a community, and I served for 3 years as the chief of staff of the Chicago Police Department. There is a necessity for us to have a relationship with law enforcement by virtue of the threat that we face as a community. And it's my personal belief that we have built up often good relationships with law enforcement. That allows us to have tough conversations with them. And it's conversations we have led at a national level with our law enforcement partners related to diversity, equity, and justice issues, and the sensitivities in the community related to that, as well as the broader society. I think, at the end of the day, if you have a situation like Colleyville or Pittsburgh, there is no other entity when you call 911 that is responding. So there is an incumbency of that coordination and that partnership. I think how we approach it, and this is where we have a lot of conversations with our lay leaders and rabbis. How do we approach that conversation so that we can ensure that should an event happen, there's a response that we can have, but also how do we approach the relationships so that all members of the community feel welcome? And in some respect, the community needs to drive that. We've had very tough conversations where certain community members, they're adamantly opposed to the law enforcement presence, and we have to work through that. There needs to be a sensitivity around that. And there's long established reasons why that sensitivity exists. Hopefully we can reach a place where we can have that conversation in a civil manner with law enforcement so that everyone is respectful of one another and understands how we can approach these issues so that we do ensure not only the feeling of safety and security for members and community individuals in the community who want to walk into the institutions, but then the actual security that happens if there's an event.
Gil, if I could add a little bit there, I think Michael's point about relationship building is critical, and we encourage all of our synagogues, whether they have armed police out for services or they never do, that they build relationships with their local law enforcement. They spend the time to get to know their law enforcement and ensure the law enforcement knows them as a community, meet as many of the congregants as possible in a social setting. We encourage you during in-person events, invite your local law enforcement in for Kiddush and Oneg, invite them in for the Purim spiel, or any events you have, make it part of your community outreach to engage your local law enforcement. The more they know your institution, the more they know your membership, the better they'll be able to serve it. And the better, at the same time as the membership gets to know law enforcement, the more comfortable they will be with engaging them in general, especially in an emergency.
Thank you. So I want to touch on a couple of other questions that are a little bit different in scope, and then we'll bring it together. So first of all, we are in the greater Washington region, center for a lot of activity, a lot of protests, a lot of perspectives. Is there anything different that we should be doing in this region than what perhaps you might suggest elsewhere, understanding that every part of the country is different. But is there anything unique about this region, or is it really mostly about each institution that is the focus?
I'll share from a national perspective. I think there's something very unique about your federation, as everyone is, but I think the fact that you can stand in certain parts of your community and with a stone hit 27 different overlapping law enforcement agencies is a unique structure that exists. I think it goes to why it's so critical that you have a program such as you do with Robert at the helm, and the reality of the strong federation that exists under your leadership, Gil, that plays that central convening, coordinating component aspect in so many areas of Jewish life. Security is just another one of those. And I think that is really the value of the federation, and it's the value of having a program like this so that you can do that integration, coordination, and communication in a more seamless manner. So that's really unique, but you have solved it and are addressing it in the way that only a federation such as yours could.
Thank you. Okay, so just a couple of more thoughts. So Robert, when you going back to some of the training questions, we had one question about how deep training should be going in a synagogue or an organization. Right here, we're focusing a lot about synagogues, but we have JCCs. We have a wide variety of organizations. We have organizations that just primarily may hold events or other things. I think at one point we noted there was something, and you'll correct me, 250 Jewish organizations or some number like that in the greater Washington region. Maybe that's a little high. But when you think about the training that's required, is this something that is leadership? Is it a subset? Is the goal to train every single person within the organization? How would you think about that? I guess both from a synagogue perspective, and then we'll look at a very different model, which is a JCC, where it's a different type of constituency, perhaps.
Gil, I wish I could every year train every member of our community on situational awareness and active threat and stop the bleed at a minimum. Practicalities being, there would never be enough people like me to do that. That being said, I think we take it institution by institution. We look at the way the institution functions, the synagogue, the JCC, the day school, and we are selective. We focus on the professional staff that are there every day. We focus on the lay leadership who are part of the larger conversation and influence within the organizations. And then we steadily work out that bubble to encompass as many people as we can. In an emergency, every individual that's had some training becomes a leader in that emergency. So the more people we have trained, the more leaders we will have in the moment. I had this conversation yesterday with one of the synagogues, is how do we stage this? And I said, that's a good conversation. Let's talk more and let's see what your rabbi and the president of your congregation thinks. And these are my thoughts. I shared with them the same thoughts I did just now. So we take it institution by institution with the goal of getting as many people as trained as possible on a recurring basis.
Thank you. So for the people who are watching and may not be the leaders of an organization, but they're members, what should they be doing? Should they be taking any specific action? What are their next steps coming out of this conversation that you would recommend if they want to learn more, do more, et cetera, particularly within their organization?
I would say begin by engaging the leadership of the synagogue or community center or school that you're affiliated with, or the organization you're affiliated with, joining that conversation, contributing your thoughts on and concerns and expectations, as I said earlier, about the safety and security of your institution. And then we'll take it that next step. As I said, everybody that's engaged has a chance to influence and be a leader in this. Reach out, ask for the training for yourself or your group, and engage in the grants process. Help your organization engage. There are federal and state grants, and there is at least one county grant right now that helps organizations meet those gaps between their operating budgets and their needs for financial resources in this domain.
Thank you. Robert, I have one more question for you that came up, and it is about recognizing that no building is completely secure, right? I mean, we cannot, we're not going to have full lockdown, whether people coming in or the building. Does the training, and you can talk more about the assessments, provide some understanding of both the risk and ways to mitigate those? And perhaps you can talk a little bit about the assessments that are done.
Certainly, Gil. A security assessment of a facility or organization is our starting point to understand the posture, where we are today, and map out where we need to go. Part of that is training for individuals, staff, and leadership and general membership. The other piece of it are the operational guidelines, the protocols and policies of the organizations. What do I do as a professional staff member in this set of circumstances? What do I do as a lay member? What do I do as a rabbi? What is my part and what is my role in responding to incidents? Understanding the situational awareness, how to recognize trouble, what you might do as an individual and what you should do as part of your organization or in a particular space. It's a collaborative effort between the training I give and the policies and procedures we help the organization to develop for themselves. Yes, when we meet with ushers before High Holy Days, we talk about situational awareness and we talk about their protocols for their synagogue in general and for High Holy Days, for example. So understanding what steps to take when a particular type of incident occurs as part and parcel. As I said, it's not all me, it is a collaborative effort with the organization.
Great, thank you. I guess I'm going to, before we finish up, I'm going to open it up to each one of you if there's any thoughts you'd like to share. I do want to ask Michael just one question leading into the, and then you can expand. There's, we know that more happens than what we know about. And I guess the question is, one, is there, can you share a little bit about that in general? And two, the thinking of, when things become public, when they should become public, when we should respond, when we shouldn't, just kind of the general idea of how SCN thinks about it. Because as our partner with security, obviously the best security is one that's prevented before anything happens. But how does SCN think about that, and how might we think about that as well?
It's a great question, Gil. So we work, part of our role is to serve as the official liaison with the FBI and Homeland Security. So we're assessing the threat level every day, our team of intel analysts, and they're in coordination with Robert and his colleagues on a daily basis. We believe that we are in the most complex and dynamic threat environment facing our community in the country than at any time in the nation's history. And that is because of the unique confluence between foreign terrorist organizations, domestic terrorism organizations, the potential for individuals to be radicalized to violence by any number of different ideologies, the proliferation of material online. So we're dealing with threats every single day. We are the only faith-based institution in the country, our duty desk, that has a direct connectivity to the FBI's National Threat Operations Center, and they are in communication every single day. So we are constantly balancing dealing with that reality and when do you inform the community. It's the value of having an individual like Robert or a professional security director that we can work with in the community to say, either he's identified something or the duty desk has identified something, and we're working to make a calculation of how this needs to be addressed and handled with local, state, or federal law enforcement, and at what point is it worthy of making the larger community aware of it. And if there is a threat to life or that is where the community will benefit from knowing about it, right? If it's online and there's no actionable information versus we know that someone's in an area, or we believe them to be an area, and a decision is made that we're going to increase security at facilities, we're constantly evaluating that. We do not want the community to live in fear. That's why we have a professional organization. We have a professional individuals that can make that calculus just as they did every single day in law enforcement. Bad guys exist. The threat is real. The fear, but fear is ultimately a construct. And so how we try to balance it is to handle that construct with a sense of empowerment and a strong action plan that we can give to facilities, individuals, and organizations so they can implement things, not be immobilized by fear. That's not the goal.
Thank you. Robert, Amy, any concluding words you'd like to share?
I just have two thoughts because I was just sharing them in a staff meeting yesterday. Just to remind the whole world that there's a greater chance that someone in your building will have a heart attack than there is that there'll be a shooter in your building. And as much as these trainings are really important, and adding to this, we must train just for good first aid. Everybody should know how to do. I just redid my CPR training a few weeks ago too. So everybody, let's do that too. You know, how to use the defibrillator machine. The stop the bleed is so important. And let's not let all this other security also like override the other kind of work that we need to do to keep our members safe and to really live by the command to preserve life, pikuach nefesh. It means many things. So let's remember that too, if we can, as much as these things are just at the fore right now in our minds. So I just always want to put in that plug. So thanks for letting me do that, Gil.
Thank you. Robert?
And to echo Rabbi Amy's statement, these are horrific events that we're considering here today. They're incredibly low probability, but incredibly high impact. That's why we have the conversation, and that's why we prepare for them. Along the way, there are a lot of other much more likely things, such as a medical emergency or a fire or something of that nature that we need to prepare for. All these work together in a good plan for the safety, security, preparedness of our organizations. There are things we can do if we, as Michael says, we've prepared now for those eventualities. We can commit to action. We can take charge of our future and our safety.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all three of you, to Michael, Robert, Rabbi Schwartzman, really for joining us today and for everything that you do for this community and everything you do nationally. Your leadership, all three of you, has really, is tremendous day in and day out. And I could not thank you more. I'd also like to thank David Yaffe, Chair Federation Security Committee, for starting off the webinar and for leading us so well as we think through how to strengthen security in this community. I do want to reiterate what we've heard throughout this webinar, that we need to understand security, we need to focus on it, we need to elevate it. At the same time, we also need to understand what we're here to do. And we're here to build community, connect people to each other and to Jewish life, and to really strengthen the Jewish community in this region and nationally. And so how do we do all of those things together, understanding that there are ways that they actually can complement each other, but there may be times where we need to think about balances. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Education on this subject is a critical part of enhancing our security efforts, and you being here today is an important part of that process. If you'd like to learn more about security efforts in Greater Washington, please go to shalomdc.org/security. And thank you again, all of you, for joining us today. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.